Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to the recording of our program on April 22nd, 2022.
I know you all came here hoping to be greeted by our President, Charles Brewer, and all you get is this cheap plastic substitute. Anyway, I'm Jack Fenn, Vice President of the Civil War Study Group, and we want to welcome you here to our session this morning. And we'll get started with our speaker, Ranger Eric Mink, one of the National Park's excellent historians. But just first, we want to remind you of a couple of upcoming events. Our annual dinner is going to take place on Friday, the 14th of May, here and there, in the next room. We'd really invite you to sign up for that. You can do it on the website, and civilwarstudygroup.org, right? And pardon me.
Charles, that's a reminder, Charles.
And this is a good reminder, isn't it? Anyone else want to turn off their telephone?
Spam call.
Anyway, I apologize for that. Anyway, so on Friday the 14th, dinner here. The bar is open at 5:30, 6:30. Dinner begins, and I think you'll enjoy our speaker. He is an author from Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. His name is Carlton Young, and the title of his presentation, as well as the book that he has written, is Voices from the Attic, and it's about letters that he found in his attic that were written by two Union soldiers. I mean, that wrong. He may have been one Union and one Confederate soldier. Worth coming to hear, and to get accurate information about our speaker, check the website. I'll point out to you, civilwarstudygroup.org. Also, that means that next month there is no regular monthly meeting. Our next regular monthly meeting will take place on Friday, the 24th of June, and Jean Bennett will speak on the topic of 10 battles around and in Winchester. We'd like to come to our speaker today. One more thing to remind you of is that we have boxes of books over here. Please take, so I don't have to take as many back downstairs. But yes, you're welcome to take them. They belong to you at that point, and we hope that when you finish, you'll be able to share them with somebody else. But our speaker today, as I said, is Eric Mink. He's been with the National Park Service as a historian for 30 years now. He's worked at battlefields, various battlefields of the Civil War. He grew up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And came to Fredericksburg to attend the then Mary Washington College, from which he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts and a major in Historic Preservation and American Studies. Right out of college, Eric scored a summer job working as a Park Service ranger at Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania National Military Parks. And for 4 years, he worked at various parks, including Gettysburg, Manassas, in the field of interpretation, museums, and cultural resource management. Eric's first permanent posting was as a park guide at the Richmond National Battlefield Park. Since 2021, he's been a historian and a cultural resource specialist at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. Eric has long been interested in the Civilian Conservation Corps and has been researching for some years the CCC's activities at the local military parks. He's eager to share what he has learned and hopes that you will find what he has to share interesting to you as well. Eric.
Thank you for having me here this morning. I've been telling folks this is only the second time that I've been able to get out and actually talk to a group in the last over 2 years now at this point. And so I apologize if I'm a little rusty, and this might go long, it might be very short. I'm not 100% sure. A little out of practice, but we'll bring our programs. But when I was asked to come and speak to you all, I actually pitched the idea of a talk on the 1921 Marine Corps maneuvers on the Wilderness Battlefield. But it was asked that I talk about the Civilian Conservation Corps, which, to be honest, I've never been asked to talk about the Civilian Conservation Corps. Being a military park here in the local area, we're typically almost always asked to talk about military things and events. And the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, is something that I've really become very interested in. And the reason being is that the Civilian Conservation Corps, the way we see the battlefields here locally, when you go out to the Wilderness Battlefield, in fact, yesterday, I was inhaling buckets of pollen just off our shared boundary here to the south, walking along what we refer to as the Gordon Flank Attack Trail. Where the Lake of the Woods stables are, you can access that trail across our boundary there, as I saw yesterday. And that trail is actually something that was created by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. The way in which we see the battlefields today are heavily influenced by the work of men who were here 90 years ago. Their influence, they created, essentially, the battlefield park, what we see, and how our visitors who come here from all over the world essentially see the battlefields the way the Civilian Conservation Corps and the National Park Service in those early years, 90 years ago, how they envisioned the battlefield park to look. We are reaching for our battlefield park, our military park here. We are about to hit a very important milestone and birthday. The Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, which is actually a shortened version of our full name. We are the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania County Battlefields Memorial National Military Park. I always get it wrong. We've appeared on Jeopardy because we are the longest, in all seriousness, we are the longest name in the national park system. But we always just refer to it as Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. We were created on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1927, as a park. So we're just 5 years shy of our 100th birthday as a battlefield and military park. So that's very important to us, is that we are approaching that milestone. And I think it's important, before we get started on the CCC, to kind of understand the actual park itself and what was created and why it was created. Again, 1927, so we're talking 60 years following the end of the American Civil War. And a lot had occurred in 60 years. A lot had occurred in this area in 60 years. And so when many of our visitors come here, predominantly in Fredericksburg, but definitely here in the wilderness, when our visitors come, they often ask us, well, what happened? You know, where do these neighborhoods come from? How come this doesn't necessarily look like 1862 or 1864? And that's because the park itself was not created until 60 years after the war. And even then, it took a very long time for the park to develop and for land to be acquired. And the act that was the Calvin Coolidge actually signed into law, creating us on February 14th, 1927, it said that our purpose was to mark and preserve, for historical purposes, the breastworks, earthworks, gun emplacements, walls, or other defenses or shelters used by the armies. And that legislation, they created the park, said nothing about buying the battlefield. It was about what we refer to as resources, those tangible physical things that remain from the event that we are here to commemorate. And so that means the remaining earthworks, any structures that might still remain were included in that, sheltered areas, things that the Army's created, those tangible things. And so when you drive through the Wilderness Battlefield on Hillyule Drive, you will notice that the earthworks are just off the road. So when the park was created, we bought just enough land to protect those earthworks and to create a road so our visitors could see them. And thus, the battlefields or fields, or in this case, the wilderness, the woods, oftentimes, were not acquired, and over the decades, were built upon and developed for other purposes. So the park was created to conserve those physical resources. If they weren't here, we wouldn't be here. That's how we refer to it. It was created in 1927, and at that time, the park was under the jurisdiction of the War Department. It wasn't until 1933 that battlefields that were national parks were actually transferred from the War Department to the National Park Service. That occurred in 1933. The idea at the time was that military parks, battlefield parks, under the War Department. But in 1933, the National Park Service made a push to bring those preserves, those parks, into the National Parks system. So 1933 is when our local park was transferred to the National Park Service. And that's important because the National Park Service has a mission, and it's a mission that we still look to. Even though the parks were transferred in 1933, the National Park Service was created in 1916. So the National Park Service existed before our park was transferred to it. But the Organic Act, which is what we refer to as what created the National Park Service, as a federal agency, and it says that its purpose is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And I use this a lot when I give programs, and after 30 years, every time I read this, I still have to go back and read it 3 or 4 times to really take it in. A long sentence, and it says a lot. But this is what we do as an agency. The important words here are conserve. It doesn't say we preserve. It says we conserve, and there's a difference between the two. Preservation means you take something and you freeze it in place. You try to keep it from ever changing. We can't do that necessarily with the lands and the property we acquire, because we are also here for the enjoyment. And we interpret enjoyment to mean making it available to the public. So we have to do things such as build roads, build parking lots, build trails, put up signs, do those things to provide for the enjoyment, for the education of our visitors. And so conservation, what that means is you try to preserve the important elements of something while at the same time allowing for change. And that's what we do. The Park Service, beginning in 1933, the War Department in 1927, we didn't come into these areas and just freeze it in place. We are constantly changing. We're putting up new signs. We're putting in new trails, new parking areas. That is conservation, not necessarily preservation. The other thing that we're supposed to do is to make sure that we leave these places unimpaired. And this is honestly a really big request or mission or statement for us to do. We're supposed to conserve natural and historical objects as well as the wildlife, to provide for the enjoyment, but we're also to make sure we don't impair those things that we're taking care of. So when we put in a parking lot, when we put in a road, we got to make sure we're doing it with some sensitivity to those earthworks, potential archaeological sites, those physical, tangible things that remain from the period of significance, which, with the creation of the park, were Civil War. The trenches, the earthworks, the buildings, those types of things. So we have this sort of balance, preserving those things as best we can, while also recognizing through conservation that things around will change. And to do it providing for the enjoyment of the public. It is, those of us who work for the National Park Service work really hard at this and hope that those who come after us look at what we've done and say, did a pretty good job. Being a steward, we're hopefully making sure we're not impairing the resources we're here to take care of, while at the same time making them available for the public to enjoy. So the park is created in 1927. The War Department begins acquisition of land, ribbons of land, where the earthworks ran. If you look at our early maps from the 1930s, the Park Service owns just slivers of land. Those slivers of land are the reason why places such as Lake of the Woods, Lake Wilderness, Fawn Lake, have come in the areas that are bordering Park Service lands. It's because we weren't acquiring large swaths of land, just these ribbons where the earthworks were located. The same year that the properties, the battlefield parks and military parks were transferred to the National Park Service, 1933, the Civilian Conservation Corps was created. I'm sure we're all familiar with why the CCC came about. What was going on in the United States or around the world at this time? The Great Depression, exactly. 1929, the Great Depression. Unemployment was at 23.6% in 1933. In the age group of men between the ages of 17 and 25, unemployment was 54%. More than 50% in that age group were unemployed. And so unemployment, obviously, during the Great Depression was huge. FDR, President Franklin Roosevelt, was elected in 1932, and 3 weeks after taking office, Senate Bill 598, which was known as the Emergency Conservation Work Act, was introduced. It passed both houses. It was on the president's desk for signature in only 4 days. Consider that today. Congress passing something that quickly and getting it on the president's desk in 4 days. But what the Emergency Conservation Work Act did was a lot of things. But for our purposes this morning, it created the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. And the purpose of the Civilian Conservation Corps was to get young men back to work and to provide and assist the country, to assist the United States in many different ways. Relief, recovery, and reform is what they refer to, the CCC. And conservation, again, remember, conservation, that word, taking care of things but allowing for change. And that's what the CCC was doing. In 1933, the previous 50 years, going back into the late 19th century, industrialization and mass deforestation had devastated the landscape and the environment on this continent. In fact, by 1934, more than 1/6 of North America lacked topsoil. A tremendous environmental concern. Farming and not understanding the conservation, taking care of the land. And so the CCC was brought in, and that was a major part of its role. We're going to talk about the CCC camp that was here at the Wilderness, but there were 4 Civilian Conservation Corps camps established in the Fredericksburg area. 3 were on the military park, or on our national park. There was a 4th. It was down on Catharpin Road. It was called Camp MacArthur. While the 3 CCC camps that were on the park did work on the park, this 4th one was assisting local farmers in the techniques of plowing, of irrigating, things to assist with conservation of the area, planting trees, an area where erosion was out of control. So conservation, and there was, like I said, a 4th camp that was here, and they became known, the CCC, as the Forest Army, is what they were referred to, because these men, these camps all over the country were planting trees to help reestablish soil, stop erosion, and those types of things. But they were also assisting with parks. And I'll give you some statistics toward the end here of what the CCC did with regard to parks, both national and state, during their period of existence. But the organization, the CCC, the way it was set up, there were 4 federal agencies involved in managing the CCC. The CCC was a program, it was not an agency. And this program was managed by the Department of Labor, which was responsible for recruiting, responsible for getting men to enroll in the CCC. The U.S. Army was involved. The Army provided supplies, logistical support, and ultimately the Army took over management of the camps. If you're suddenly going to take hundreds of thousands of young men from around the country, put them into an organization with tiered authority and leadership to work on projects, who has that kind of knowledge on how that might work? So the Army was brought in for the management. And then the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior, which the National Park Service were part of the Department of the Interior, Department of Ag and Department of Interior provided the work. What are the projects that need to be done? Agriculture, again, helping with farms, helping with reforestation and erosion concerns. The Interior, similar, but also with national parks. By the midsummer of 1933, 275,000 men had enrolled in 1,300 camps that were located across the country. The very first CCC camp was right here in Virginia, Edinburgh, Virginia. It was known as Camp NF1. NF stood for National Forest, and it was the George Washington National Forest is where they were working. It opened in April of 1933. For us, here in the Fredericksburg area, at the National Military Park, the first camp to open was in June of 1933. It was down at the Spotsylvania battlefield. For those of you who are familiar with Spotsylvania battlefield, we have a tourist stop and a site known as the McCool House down in Spotsylvania. And those fields all around the McCool House was the site of the CCC camp down there. Interestingly enough, that camp, even while the CCC focused on young men in 1933, 17 to 25 years old roughly, they also realized that the Depression was hitting veterans really hard, World War I veterans. And so the CCC then expanded its enrollment to include World War I veterans who were struggling for employment. And our camp at Spotsylvania was a veterans camp. So veterans from World War I were part of the enrollees down there. The Spotsylvania camp only lasted a year or two before it closed. The efforts of the CCC then looked at the 2 camps that would establish at the Wilderness battlefield and then one at Chancellorsville. This photo is an aerial photo of the camp at the Wilderness battlefield. It was established October 14, 1933. And this camp remained in operation through 1941, 8 years in the Wilderness battlefield. And during its existence, 5 companies rotated. The way the CCC was organized was men would enlist for 6-month terms, often re-enlisting. They would be grouped together, 190 to 200 men, a military army, sometimes predominantly reserve. A captain or a lieutenant would be in charge of the company, and then that company would be assigned to a location. It didn't necessarily mean that the men in these camps were local. They came from New York, they came from Pennsylvania, they came from all over. And they were sent, once they enrolled for the 6-month period, they were placed in a company, and then that company could be sent anywhere in the country to do whatever work the CCC was looking to do. So approximately 190 men. We'll get back to this photo in a little more detail but, toward the end, but for those of you, well, I know you're all familiar, this is Saunders Field on the Wilderness Battlefield. So this is Route 20, running right here. Our exhibit shelter is right here. This building up here is still back in the woods. If you walk the trail, you walk past that building. So that's where the Civilian Conservation Corps, it was known as MP-4. MP means military park, and that's what's right here, these stone letters at the entrance. MP-4VA, Military Park, Camp 4, Virginia. Later they would change it to NP, meaning National Park. But originally it was MP-4VA. And in fact, if you go out and walk in this field, those letters are still in the field, flush with the ground. You'll trip over them. So Camp MP-4. The first company to arrive was company number 282. The companies had numbers. So the 282nd company was the first to arrive, and it originated in Camp Dix, New York, and May 18, 1933. It was sent originally to Camp F-65 in Garden Valley, Idaho, then to Smiths Ferry, Idaho, then finally to Camp MP-4 here in the wilderness. So you can see it was organized in New York, sent to Idaho, landed here in Virginia, and then headed 2 years later, 1935, back to New York. So these companies would come from all over, and this was a great experience for the men. Not only work, not only being productive, not only earning money, but for many of these men, getting to see the country. This is a photo of Camp 282 at the wilderness, and up top are the buildings. That is the entrance, and there's the flagpole there in the center. That is the camp. They had barracks, they had buildings. The camp MP-4 was comprised of 4 barracks, a mess hall, which included a kitchen, food storage room, and dining room, a recreation hall, which had a reading room, an assembly hall, a stage, and a game room. There was the headquarters building, which had the infirmary, office for the camp, as well as the camp officers' quarters. There was a bathhouse, which had the showers, a latrine. There was an oil and blacksmith shop, powerhouse, pump house, park offices, and then Army and Park Service garages. So it was quite a complex, as we can see from the aerial photo here. Quite a number of buildings spread out over the property. The men themselves came from all over. The CCC hired foremen to instruct these men on the activities they were to do. And it was labor. It was manual labor is what they were involved in for the most part. But the foremen themselves actually came from the local area, is what they tried to do. They didn't try to bring in foremen from outside the area in which the company. So the foremen would stay at the camp while the companies rotated through. And the foreman at Camp MP-4, looking over a roster we have of who the foremen were, you have names such as Apperson, Almond, Tinder, Parker, Stevens, Bisco, all local names here in Orange and Culpeper and western Spotsylvania County. So these men were the ones that would teach and instruct in the work and oversee it. The daily schedule for the men was first bugle, wake up at 6:20, reveille, get out at 6:30, breakfast at 7, general cleanup 7:30, work call was at 7:50, and work call was get together with whatever you're assigned to do that day, head out into the park with your foreman, and begin work. 12 noon was dinner, return to work after dinner, 4 p.m. return from your work project, 5 p.m. retreat and flag ceremony, 5:10 supper, 6 to 9 p.m. were classes, 9 p.m. lights extinguished, and 10 p.m. it's everybody in bed, everybody out. That 6 to 9 p.m. was important. The 3 R's I mentioned, reform was one of them. The CCC was not just about manual labor and getting work done, it was about education. The men could sign up for classes. Men learned how to read, they learned how to write, they took classes, they could get high school diplomas through the CCC. So it was also assisting in those aspects of life as well. So education was very important, and the men would, or the CCC would hire teachers, local teachers, who would come in and instruct classes on various things. Obviously, it's centered around work, but again, there was a lot more to the life of a CCC enrollee. Pay was essentially $1 a day, is what they were paid. So $30 a month was the pay of the CCC enrollee. But when you signed up, you made an obligation that $22 to $25 of that pay would be sent home. You would keep $5. Now you're being fed, you're being housed, you don't really have many expenses, you're being clothed. But the purpose of the CCC was also not just to invigorate the economy, there's 1933, the Depression, not just to invigorate the economy locally, but everywhere. So the men sending their money home to their families and assisting with economic recovery in those areas as well. So they got to keep $5. They worked 40 hours a week. What are you going to do with $5? The weekends, the trucks would take them into Fredericksburg. And so basically on $5, the movie theaters were getting a lot of business. There wasn't a lot else that they were going to be able to do. Reading the local papers, lots of articles about weekends when the CCC boys came into town with $5 in their pocket. But in addition to work, they were expected to take advantage of the educational opportunity. Vocational classes, mechanical and architectural drawing were offered, drafting, concrete construction, brick and stone masonry, house wiring, carpentry, retail selling, bookkeeping, business principles, and public speaking were all classes being offered to the CCC enrollees in the evening. There were academic classes. You could learn to speak German, French. There were science classes, drama, music, math. These young men were learning not only skills for perhaps income, they were also receiving an education. And men could get academic credits that applied to high school. Being young men, recreational activities were really important. Sports, baseball, wrestling, boxing, football. They'd often set up a team, and they'd play other camps and travel around to play other camps on the weekends. And you can look in the local papers and find the box scores for baseball games between the CCC camp. Going into town for dances and going to the movies on the weekends. This is a newsletter. Most camps had newsletters. You can go on the Library of Virginia, the State Library website, and find and download all of the newspapers that were published at the Wilderness Camp. I've read through them all, and a lot of it makes no sense because it's all inside jokes or stories, and they're referencing people that you don't know who they are. But here is the box score for our baseball games, letting everybody know how they did against the boys in Stafford or wherever they went to play on the weekends. Baseball at the Wilderness was kind of interesting. We'll go back to this photo here. Here you see across Route 20, there's a backstop, baseball backstop. That was land not owned by the National Park Service. The owner of the land on the south side of Saunders Field had previously allowed enrollees to use his land for baseball practice free of charge. But March of 1938, he began asking for a payment of $10 a month for use of his land for their baseball activities. Interestingly enough, his name was James Dempsey, another good local name. Although he was the owner of the land, James Dempsey was apparently friendly with the camp superintendent at the time. However, going through the files at the National Archives, it appears that there was tremendous tension, for whatever reason, between Dempsey and the company commander, the company that was stationed there. The company commander named Leo Poindexter, and this apparently boiled over into a verbal confrontation. And Poindexter, when Dempsey had come to talk to him about the baseball being played on his property, and Poindexter threw him out of camp, the local gentleman, so thus the request for $10. Interestingly enough, the incident was eventually resolved when the camp secured the use of a field a mile down the road, and then Camp Poindexter was rotated out to another company. But in a moment of irony, after all of this activity trying to deal with Mr. Dempsey and his land and their baseball playing, one evening the enrollees were responded to a call for assistance with a house fire, and it was the same month. And when they got there, it was Mr. Dempsey's house. And the CCC enrollees extinguished the fire, and from that point forward, they were allowed to play whatever baseball they wanted on this property. But again, recreational activity was very, very important to the men of the CCC. Alcohol was absolutely forbidden in the camps, and the men were not allowed to return to camp intoxicated. However, we found in the newspaper, local newspaper, an announcement that said, arrested on complaint of authorities that she was selling liquor to members of the Civilian Conservation Corps camps in the county, Feeney Tapp, 60-year-old Spotsylvania woman, had been fined $50 and costs and given a 30-day suspended sentence for possession of a still. So Feeney Tapp, who lived on the battlefield down along the Plank Road, a few miles south of camp, the Tapp Farm, which is today part of the park and one of our tour stops. Feeney, who had been a child when the battle was fought, she had a still and was selling liquor to CCC boys. So life, there were lots of things to do in addition to the manual labor. It's interesting, we also had African American companies here at Camp MP-24. Well, we had one. There was also an African American company stationed at Camp MP-3, which was at Chancellorsville. CCC was segregated. It's 1930s. Jim Crow prevails. And so in late July 1934, Company 362 was preparing to transfer to Chancellorsville. 362 was an African American company. And when it was announced that the company that would be arriving was African American, reading in the local newspapers, the Fredericksburg officials were not very pleased with this. In fact, they said that they were not objecting to the placing of Negroes in the county, but because they were brought here from the north, if the, and I'm using the terminology of the paper, if the colored World War veterans were Southerners, no objections would have been raised. It is the importation of outsiders which does not meet with approval. So in other words, if they're African Americans from the South who understand what Jim Crow laws are, not a problem. The CCC's response was, if you don't want the company, we'll just close down the camp and transfer it elsewhere. The CCC brought a lot of money into the community. All the supplies for all the work they're doing is being bought from local businesses. So the city of Fredericksburg backed off. But on October 1937, Company 333, an African-American company, arrived at Camp MP-4 here in the wilderness, and they stayed until May of 1938. Now, the work that the men did on the wilderness battlefield, Camp MP-4 pretty much stuck to the wilderness. The men also did some work down in Spotsylvania, but mostly on the wilderness battlefield. Camp MP-3, which was at Chancellorsville, it was responsible for Chancellorsville Battlefield and Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg Battlefield did not have its own CCC camp. The wilderness, the men that were here, living in Saunders Field, what was then Saunders Field, they took care of wilderness battlefield. And the work centered on it. And most of what they did was landscaping. What the Act in 1927 did was it created a park. And that's what we are. We are a park. I often tell folks, we don't own the battlefields. We don't take care of the battlefields. We take care of a park. Because the battlefields themselves are much larger than what we actually manage to take care of. And so the idea in 1933 was to create a park. And a park has roads. It's very well landscaped. And it has a look to it. And that's what the CCC was responsible for. They did a lot of planting of trees along the road, Hilliard Drive. The CCC wasn't specifically responsible for the construction of Hilliard Drive. That was a little bit beyond their capability. The federal government actually put the road building were contracts with companies, but the CCC would lend a hand when necessary. But they were responsible for planting the road signs. The roads today, we've taken a different approach in the fact that we go for a natural look. But in the 1930s, dogwoods, flowering trees, creating this sort of look as you drove along a park road. And so landscaping was a lot of what they did. And being on a battlefield, you can imagine, they were transplanting trees, digging trees up from back in the woods and bringing them to other areas where erosion was a problem after road construction and things like that. And you can imagine what they found. William Howard, who was a local fellow who was hired as a foreman, Howard, in his reminiscences, said that in the course of restoring trench lines, working with the earthworks, we would rake out muskets, canteens, and other large objects. Moses Dempsey, who lived nearby, remembered that it used to be that a child could walk through the woods without stumbling or cutting his foot on an old piece of rusty iron. Things got a lot better after the CCC boys came here. They used to back dump trucks up to their work areas and fill them with scrap and haul it to Fredericksburg. So they're pulling up all sorts of relics out of the battlefield. And we have photos of CCC boys standing and holding artillery shells that they find in the ground and things along those lines. Our approach is not to pick up and pose with artillery shells today. We call it Quantico if that happens. But you know, landscaping, digging up trees. These are all photos of the CCC at work in the Wilderness Battlefield. Moving a tree on the Wilderness Battlefield in 1937. So digging up and transplanting trees. Earthworks, taking care of the remnants of the trenches that the soldiers made. And when I say taking care of, there's a long-standing sort of rumor or legend that the CCC dug or redug earthworks on our battlefields. Not necessarily. What they did was, the soil around here, as I'm sure any of you who try to maintain a lawn understand, you know, the red clay of this area in the topsoil, in the gravel, it's often not conducive. And so there was serious erosion problems, and we still deal with serious erosion problems on our earthworks because we're trying to take care of something that we can't stop. You know, it's a mound of dirt. Someday it's going to be flat no matter what we do. It's just time. It's going back to nature. in its natural state. But what the CCC did was they would sod the earthworks. They would bring in sod and work really hard to keep that sod going, because the grass vegetation would help to hold it together and retard erosion. So sodding earthworks was something they did, making them also look very nice as folks drove through. Fuel reduction. And when I say fuel reduction, we refer to that for fires. A lightning strike in the woods with lots of downed trees and limbs. Fuel is the wood that's on the ground, the limbs that have fallen. It's a lightning strike can catch fire, and fire was a big concern. And firefighting wasn't in the 1930s as efficient as it is today. And there weren't fire companies in certain areas. So fuel reduction, they would literally be out cleaning up the woods and removing large amounts of downed trees. There was construction projects. This is, if you've driven down Hilliole Drive today off of Route 20, on the left there is a parking area, a picnic area. That's this picnic area. They built amenities for our visitors. So building a picnic area, lots of picnic areas. I don't know that people picnic necessarily as much today as used to when on vacation, but putting in the picnic area there was also something they did. They did help with the roads. They built the stone bridges. You may not notice it, but when you drive down Hilliole Drive, you cross over Wilderness Run. If you were to stop and get out, there was a magnificent stone bridge there. And we're getting ready to do some repair work on that. And the CCC, the masonry skills they were learning and developed, they built the stone bridge that crosses Wilderness Run there. So they did construction work. They also offered what we refer to today as interpretive services, guiding, information. You show up from out of state, you want to learn while I'm on Wilderness Battlefield, but I don't know what happened here. They offered guidance services. This is a sign. Here's the camp in the background. This is Route 20. And you're looking east toward the intersection with Route 3. So this is Saunders Field, that area of the camp. And the sign says, National Park Service information, free guide service at CCC headquarters building, 100 yards ahead. You are invited to use the service. So the National Park Service staff would train the CCC enrollees in the history of the area, and they would be the points of contact when visitors arrived. You had to pull into the camp, had to go to the headquarters building, and a CCC enrollee would be there and provide the information that you were looking for. He could tell you about the area. African American company enrollees were not allowed to be guides, but the white enrollees could serve as guides. So they were some of the first, not park rangers, but some of the first what we might refer to as historians on the battlefield park, providing that. And so, they also built interpretive devices. This is what we call a compass pedestal. It's a circular piece of concrete. Each of those lines heading out tells you the distance from where you're standing to some other historical point. Germanna Ford, the Widow Tatfield, Wilderness Tavern, Elwood, and that was on the ground for the visitors. The CCC built that as an interpretive device to help visitors. They also built, eventually, this is 1937, you didn't have to stop at the camp to get information. They built little contact stations, little wood cabins. This is looking up Hilliole Drive. This is Route 20 running this way. This is the north side of Route 20. So directly across Route 20 from Hilliole Drive was a contact station. And that's where the enrollee who was acting as a guide would be stationed. You'd walk in there, there'd be artifacts, things they found, rusted musket, a canteen nailed on the wall. You could get information and they'd tell you how to go about seeing the battlefield. This remained standing until 1963 when we built what we refer to as our exhibit shelter, the three-sided building in the parking area down there. Strangely enough, I actually was in this building, although I didn't realize it, when I was in college. When we built the shelter in 1963, this structure was sold to somebody locally who moved it up to Germanna Ford and used it as a hunting cabin. And then Mary Washington, when they were doing the excavations at Spotswoods Enchanted Castle, this was the house that Doug Sanford, the Mary Washington archaeologist, lived in. And when I was doing my field school up there, that's where we went to use the bathroom. We were out digging in the thing, and I had no idea. It's since sadly long gone, but it's just kind of cool that this structure that the CCC built in 1937 had managed to move around and was still around. But anyway, so they built the infrastructure that helped with our visitors, and the fact that they built that, and we built the shelter in 1963. We're following their lead as to where things are located and where our visitors go. This is a map showing the information station. And here in Saunders Field, the wilderness, this is one area where the CCC did actually build trenches that didn't exist. Their view was they were building representations for visitors to come and see. So you come and you see this little speed bump of dirt on the ground, and that's what the soldiers fought behind. It's hard to imagine for some visitors what it looked like originally. So they built, this is 1936, reconstructed earthworks behind that little building, and which is really kind of cool, except for if you don't maintain them, today, we can't tell the difference between what the CCC built and what the soldiers built in 1864. I mean, we can, thanks to the photographs, but these are still back there. We always wondered, to be perfectly honest, why there was an artillery position. That's what this is, what we refer to as a lunette. Put your cannon in here, the tube sticks it, why it's behind and shooting into the rear of the infantry trenches. Not to mention, it's on the back side of the slope. So you got to shoot up over well, that's because the CCC built it, not the soldiers who were fighting that. But it's still there, that lunette. So they built these reconstructions. And
where is that again?
if you walk up from the exhibit shelter up the slope with the rubberized mulch, and you hit our trail, Gordon Flank Attack Trail, it goes to the right. If you go to the left, you can follow the earthworks down, and right before you get to Route 20, behind that line of infantry trenches, you will see a large depression, and it's that. But here's a list of some of the accomplishments for Camp MP-24 between July 37 and February 38. Listing all sorts of things. The amount of fences built, guardrails, road maintenance, public picnic areas, seating and sodding, really doing a tremendous amount of work. They were the manpower to create the battlefield park. Camp MP-4 at the Wilderness Battlefield closed April of 1941. CCC came to an end in 1942. Any guesses why? There was another need for young men, and the Depression was ending, and had ended with mobilization for World War II. So, Camp MP-4 was open from October of 1933 through April of 1941. 5 companies and hundreds of men moved through that camp. For the CCC overall, we don't have specific numbers for how many men exactly went through Camp MP-4, but we do have numbers for the CCC program nationwide with regard to its impact on the National Park Service. 2 million enrollees performed work in 198 CCC camps in 94 national parks, and 697 camps in 881 state, county, and municipal areas. The whole concept of state parks started with the CCC. Virginia's state park system started because of the CCC. If you go down to Pocahontas State Park, south of Richmond, they actually have a museum to the Civilian Conservation Corps because the state park system, nationwide, all states, really began with the CCC. They needed projects, they needed something to do, and the CCC created these parks. And for us, really created a national military park. What they did for us, they built and maintained walking trails. They landscaped the park road shoulders, they preserved earthworks and defenses, conserved areas, and provided some of the first interpretive services. And as I said, in many ways, our visitors today are still seeing the battlefield park the way the CCC laid it out, or the National Park Service laid it out, and the CCC built it. So the NPS created it, and the CCC built it. Have any of you walked on what is known, we refer to as the Federal Line Trail? All right, the Federal Line Trail, great, is a trail that runs from Route 20 all the way down to the Plank Road and winds its way through backyards on the southern portion. But that trail was built by the CCC. It was known as the Warren-Wadsworth Trail, but today we refer to it as the Federal Line Trail. At one point, you come to a footbridge, you have to cross a stream. The stone abutments for that bridge, that footbridge, that's the stonework of the Civilian Conservation Corps. They built that stone bridge. As I mentioned, the Gordon Flank Attack Trail, it began as what was known as the Early Trail. Jubal Early was a Confederate general. The Early Trail. We call it the Gordon Flank Attack Trail today. Again, our exhibit shelter sits right here today. That's the parking area. This road is still there. You walk behind the shelter in the cannon. That road and access is still there. It leads up to that building up top. We refer to that as our CCC shed. Interestingly enough, that building was not really tied to the camp itself. That building was, and that's why it survives. The National Park Service used CCC funds to build 3 maintenance buildings in the park. Here at Chancellorsville and Spotsylvania, all 3 are located at the CCC camps, but these were actually National Park Service buildings, not Civilian Conservation Corps. Using Civilian Conservation Corps money and men to build it, but not part of the camp per se. So in 1941, when the camps were closed, the War Department was responsible for getting rid of the material. And the reason they don't survive anymore is because the War Department, I should say, the Department of the Army auctioned and sold them off. Local individuals bought them and used the material to do whatever they wanted on their own property, move the buildings to their own properties, whatever they decided to do. But because these were owned by the Park Service, and the Park Service was still here, that's why they survive today. So this road actually runs up to that building still today. So the camp itself was in what was an open field. Interestingly enough, when the camp was closed, the field disappeared. It all grew up. In 1963, when we built our little shelter here, this was all wooded. It wasn't until, I think, the 1980s, early 80s, that the Park Service cleared what is Saunders Field on the north side of Route 20 once again. So if you go out there today, this is Google Earth is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Here is our shelter. Here's that road running up. There is, visible from Google Earth, the entrance to the camp. There, on Google Earth, can't really see it too well, but MP-4VA is visible from Google Earth in the middle of that. So here it is, MP-4VA. In fact, I had a conversation with our maintenance staff yesterday when we were out walking the Gordon Flank Attack Trail, and we stopped and said, you guys bush hog this area. I know it's a pain to run over these things probably for you, but please don't rip them out. This is part of the park's history. So if you know where to look, you can still find things. That is the building, the maintenance building, built by the CCC with CC funds. We still use it. We store our maintenance equipment in there that we use on the wilderness battlefield. This is that compass pedestal that I showed. It's still there. You walk back in the woods, you're probably not going to find it because there's a tremendous amount of leaf dump and accumulation. But I had a suspicion a number of years ago and went out with a metal probe and clink, 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 and there it is. It's still there. Built by the CCC to assist visitors, just abandoned.
So where is it?
As you head up from the exhibit shelter on the rubberized trail and you hit the trail goes to the right, the earthworks are right in front of you. You go to the left and go all the way down to where the earthworks stop. It is on the backside of the earthworks. I couldn't find it today without a fair amount of time going back out there again. These bollards are still in the woods, and those wooden bollards surround the parking lot for the, define what was the parking lot for the contact station that the CCC built out there. These are the wood bollards that the CCC put in. They're still there. Creosote may not be great leaching into the ground, but they have certainly helped these bollards survive 90 years later. So if you know where to look, the CCC's fingerprints are all over the place. One of the CCC boys wrote in one of the camp newsletters, he said, "Many of us have been wondering whether or not our camp is different from other CCC camps. We read of conservation work, firefighting, tree planting, road building, and hundreds of other projects being done by our fellows in the CCC. But isn't there something in our job that seems missing from the work of other camps? Ours is one of a number of organizations doing work in the United States National Parks. But our camp is working on a memorial park, a park which is expected to remain as a tribute to men who fought that we today may have an undivided nation. That holds the answer. This area has been a national shrine ever since the blood of the North and South was shed on it in 1864, but it has never been officially considered as such. Our park is more or less an experiment to see if an Eastern National Park can stand with the well-known Western ones. If the experiment succeeds, it will be because we made it succeed. There is the difference, for we are on trial. What we are doing must be our best. Our work must be lasting. It must well nigh be perfect." So writing in the 1930s, the CCC enrollee recognized that what they are doing is important to this area, to this national park. And if they do it well, it will be lasting. And it certainly has been. 90 years later, we're still driving on Hilliard Drive. We're walking Gordon Flank Trail. We call it the Gordon Flank Attack Trail today, but the early foot trail. Walking on the Warren Wadsworth Trail, known as the Federal Line Trail today. Driving over the stone bridge that they built. Their work made it possible. And without the CCC, not sure what might have happened. The National Park Service didn't have the manpower and the labor in 1933. 1927, even under the War Department, to create and build a park. But the CCC made it happen. So when you go out and you walk Saunders Field, if you look for the letters, just think about the hundreds of men, boys, 17 to 24, earning $30 a month, spending their time in creating something that hundreds of thousands of visitors enjoy and come from all over the world and learn about the battles of the wilderness and our nation's history. So thank you. And if there's time, I'm sure I went long, but I'd be happy to try and answer any questions. Yes, sir.
Were the the men in the CCC, they have only a primary education? I was intrigued about classes and whatever.
From all over. Everybody, as long as you were unemployed and you met the physical and age requirements, you could enroll.
So they would have had an 8th grade or maybe a high school?
Yep. Yep. And could have potentially been college graduates. It was men who needed jobs and getting that money not only to them but back to their communities. And that was a big part of it, was getting the money back home. So yeah. If you didn't need the classes or didn't want the classes, you didn't necessarily have to take them. But I think everybody was expected to participate at some level of the education that was being offered in the evenings. Yes, sir.
Did you, excuse me, did you research what $30 a month that is today?
I did, but unfortunately last time I researched that, according to my notes, was 2011. So I can give you the equivalent. In 2011, it was $500 a month.
Yeah.
Not too bad. And definitely getting money home. Yes, sir.
Is there anything that is going on today close to this?
Similar. The CCC, and we hear about it, right? And we have heard about it, I think, in the last few years of, let's restart the CCC, or somebody should restart the CCC. There have been, over, decades, that sort of thing has come up, but it did influence organizations. We have used the YCC, which is an organization, it's the Youth Conservation Corps, and it's a similar sort of, similar in the sense that it's young people who, it's sort of like internships, although they're getting paid. It's an organization that provides young labor to conservation work. So we have brought in YCC members over time. I think we even used to have a YCC camp on the wilderness battlefield. Lyon is shaking his head. I agree.
No, you're right.
No, you're nodding your head. Yes. So we had a YCC camp on the wilderness battlefield where young people lived, and this was in the 80s, I think, 70s, 80s. So there have been similar organizations, but nothing to this scale or structure. And typically these YCC, we have another one called the Student Conservation Association, SCA, and we use those students, but these are nonprofit organizations. They aren't government run. But it's the similar concept of gaining experience for young people, helping them develop skills for a career, while at the same time providing assistance to national parks and similar organizations. Yes, sir. All right.
I might be mistaken, but I thought you said the Spotswood camp closed in 6 months.
The Spotsylvania CCC camp lasted, I think it was maybe a year.
Why is that for young people?
Well, I think it was because once they established 3 camps here, I think the real is because that was the first, and then you got Chancellorsville, and then Wilderness. I think they realized that for the park and the size of it, they suddenly had too many. And so the Spotsylvania camp, they were World War I veterans as opposed to the other 2, which were younger men. Once they rotated out, they shut down the camp. And the camp down there actually, I think, reopened after the CCC was done away with. It reopened very briefly as a state police training facility. And very, very briefly. It's always interesting because whenever we go walking in these areas and we're like, ooh, look at that depression. A Confederate soldier probably dug that from, used this for cover, and could have been that's where the CCC buried trash. We don't know. But in those areas, there was a lot going on. And we are now beginning to recognize that period as nationally significant. And so when we look at our camps as archaeological sites or landscape, they have a significance. They may not be 1861 to 65, which is why our park was created for Civil War battles and that history, but this is an important part of our nation's history. And so we're treating them with similar approaches. We don't want to lose that information and those resources without taking careful consideration of what we're doing. But if you wander the fields of Cool House, you're going to find dips and ditches and all sorts of things. But I think it was basically once 3 camps were established, and then the 4th on the Catharpin Road, which was to serve the public and farmers, I think they realized we just had way too many. And Spotsy was the one they chose to get rid of.
Quick research. I just did. $5 today is $110.58, which for $30 would be $3,317. That's not bad.
No, not bad at all. Yeah. So, yep.
What would it take to get the MP3 to marker preserved and easier to find and also dependent with the direction? Is there anything this group could do to?
Not that I'm aware of, because we're still trying to figure out what we think, it's, we don't like to remove things, to put them on display or that sort of thing. It's got site significance with where it is. And so yesterday when we were out, talking with our maintenance staff, that's the beginning of our discussions. We need to figure out, I think, what is the best way.
Well, I mean, just make it accessible.
Right.
So the general public,
Yeah.
is part of the story.
We just completed what we refer to as a cultural landscape report for the wilderness battlefield. What we do is we try to document everything we can so that we don't lose that information. And we create a report that documents it and identifies all those types of features, including that. We've completed that report, which is at the government printing office. It'll soon be available on the internet for the public to download. And it's a history of the wilderness battlefield, the park property from before the Civil War up to the present, and all the changes. And it looks at things such as the camp letters. And while this report, we didn't have the funding to do the second part, which is making recommendations about what do you do with all these little features like that. Accessibility, you can walk out there today into that field. I recommend it when the grass has been recently cut. It's easier to find. You need to keep an eye out for that ditch that goes around the entrance drive. It's only about a foot deep. There's just drainage around it. But you can go out there and you can find it. The vegetation's a little different around the letters than it is elsewhere. As far as interpreting the CCC, meaning providing signage and talking about that part of our history, and we're starting to make some moves in that direction. But right now our interpreters, we're very focused on 1861 to 1865, the reason we exist, but we're starting to expand it. So I think in the future we'll see something. But for now, our maintenance, just knowing it's there, and perhaps next time they curse their tire on the bush hog bouncing, they don't decide to remove it. They recognize what it is, and it's concrete. It's been there for 90 years, so it stands to reason it'll be there for a few more until we figure out what to do with it. But interest in the CCC, it's great. So very much appreciate the interest.
Real quick question.
Sorry.
Okay.
We need to let Eric go because
My father-in-law was in
we
CCC.
here only just a moment. And I want to say thank you very much for your presentation today, and I think it speaks to the complexity and the ongoing mission of the Park Service, and this has been a very interesting, very well presentation. If Eric has a moment, perhaps he'd like to speak
Sure.
afterward. But we want to let you go at this point. Thank you so much for Before we quit entirely, I'd like to let you know about, once again, one thing that we're doing a little bit differently about our dinner at our dinner this year. One of the things we're doing is we're going to have a raffle to give a sword, which has been in our possession for several years, to someone else who can appreciate it and so forth too. So, and Craig, we'd like to, if you come up here, please, I'd like to ask him to explain what this sword that we'll be rattling on is.
This is a replica of a model 1850 sword for the field and staff officers. And it is a replica that was used, the actual ones used by the officers on both sides. This is the one that's a kind of a model for the one that Stonewall Jackson had. His soldiers captured it and gave it to him as a gift. You remember the story over here in Culpeper County at the Battle of Cedar Mountain, where the Confederates were in retreat. The Union forces were attacking them, and Stonewall got on his horse and rode into the retreating Confederates, yelling to them to turn around and go back and face the Union. And he reached down to get his sword to lead them, and he couldn't get it out because the sword was stuck in the scabbard. So he removed the whole scabbard and sword and led the troops, and they did turn around and go back and drove the Union away. So his actual sword is on display at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond. But this one, or one pretty much like this one, it is like this one, will be raffled off at the dinner on May the 14th, and you'll be able to do your own charges with your own sword.
Thank you. Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.